Thanks so much for this wonderful invitation to be at the center, and that you have created this center together is a great achievement. It reminds me of the solidarity movement we're seeing across many universities these days. Certainly at Tufts University, the new department, the Department for Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, has been part of that, and so it's good to be here in solidarity with you. I'm going to begin the talk, and I will actually be reading from a number of sections from the book and interspersing it with some kind of connective discussions to link different portions of what I'd like to share. But I also want to mention, since it's something that you just heard, that if you want to ask me about some of that scholar activism work that I have been doing, I would really welcome that, even though that's kind of the context around the writing. So whether it's Black History in Action, or whether it's work with Project South in Atlanta and Southern Echo in Mississippi, or if you want to share some of the scholar activism that you are doing, I think this is an opportunity for mutual edification. And I'm also here to learn from all the work that you are doing here. Let me begin by reading the first paragraph from the book, and then I'll mention, talk about where I hope we might go in the next about 40 minutes or so, 35, 40 minutes or so. So we'll have ample time for question and answer. As I begin reading, I want to invite you to also pay attention, tune in to how you are experiencing what is being shared. The story that I have to tell, what I want to bring forward from the history of emancipations, is disturbing. And I just want to acknowledge that weight that is going to come into our space. And then also ask, as this weight comes into our space, what is invoked in us, what questions, what sentiments is invoked in us, and what do we do with that? I believe this is a very important part of what it is to be in the practice that we're in. And then finally, how does this connect with the work of reparations? It's a big question that we're going to get to by the end. The Bahamas, place of my birth, is a Caribbean nation state of some 700 islands and keys extending like vertebrae along the southern rim of the Sargasso Sea. Andros Island, the largest of the chain, is surrounded by tidal flats, coral reefs, karst formations, and lime muds along its rubble coasts. Atlantic waters undulate and crash at its shores, but they also penetrate into its pine-covered and craggy interior, burrowing deep cylindrical holes into the carbonate bedrock of the landscape. The island itself is pockmarked and eaten through by the alien sea. The last time I visited Andros, I was seeking to fill a void, a hole in my own family history. The island taught me something important about the presence that lives inside voids and my relationship to them. The void is the most succinct encapsulation of Atlantic slavery and its ongoing afterlife. 500 years of racial slavery designated African-descended peoples as devoid of human value. It stripped them of their personal and family names, obliterated their kinship ties, and assigned them a market price as atomized pieces of property. Slavery swallowed millions of Africans into the bellies of ships, enumerated and inventoried them, transported them across the seas, and spat them out into slave markets across the Americas and Europe. It was an incalculably traumatic system of genocide, tearing families apart and alienating people from their own sense of themselves, forcing them to reconstruct life, joy, and family again and again. Slavery constituted a centuries-long war against African peoples, and the emancipations, those acts that we have understood as the means through which slavery ended, they actually only extended the war forward in time, and they were designed to do so. Voids are complex because they are nothing at all, and yet they hold everything at once. Inside the void, Black people reconstructed life, kin, and community amid the terrorization and destruction of slavery and the plantation regime. They created new art and meaning in and beyond the whole of the ship and the void of the slave price. The enslaved rebelled and fled, tended to their ancestors, and fed and nourished their children. They saved money, they organized political movements and strikes, and constructed communities of mutual care and succor. They loved, they celebrated, and rejoiced and made space for their own liberation from within slavery's trap. One more paragraph. I began my trip to the northern Andros coast of the Bahamas in a town where my ancestors participated in the establishment of a free Black village in the aftermath of Britain's abolition of maritime trafficking in enslaved people in 1807. Free villages sprang up across many of the British Caribbean islands, especially after Britain's abolition of slavery in 1838, as Black people remade their communities in the wake of slavery. At the village of Mastic Point, Alexander Bain, a mixed-race son of a large-scale white slave owner, established one of many Bain towns, in which he apportioned plots of land to the free people, some of whom were rescued directly from the slave ships. The freed people used the land to build small homes, keep subsistence plots, and anchor their fishing boats. In the post-slavery period, the people of Mastic Point were buffeted by the currents of oppression and re-enslavement that continued after and because of emancipation. Illegal trafficking in abducted people from Africa to the Bahamas continued all the way up until the 1880s, more than 70 years after the British abolition of the slave trade. Throughout the late 19th century, the Bahamian coast served as an important port for global human trafficking. Portuguese and Spanish ships, alongside ships from Baltimore and Boston, moored themselves along these shoals as a first point of entry into the slave markets of the Caribbean. From the Bahamian carapace, slaving vessels sailed farther on to the Mississippi Cotton Kingdom, to the sugar islands of Cuba, and to the coffee plantations of Brazil, all the way into the 1880s. So I began the book, and I wanted to begin my talk by speaking about a personal void, a void in my family history, a void that everyone who comes out of the Black diaspora, the African diaspora, we all know this void in our own way, or these voids in our own ways. And the question that I'm inviting us to sit with again is, what happens when we sit close to these voids, when we walk around these voids, when we don't turn away from them, but instead we listen to hear what they have to tell us. This connects with the meaning of reparations in the following way, and I hope we'll talk about this in the question and answer. I would say there are three main modes of reparations, and all three are important. The first mode is the mode that involves restitution and compensation. I think it follows in the model of tort law, which is to say, a harm happened, how can that harm be redressed? And so in public discussion today, we see very important discussions in California, in Evanston, in Asheville, in many cities and municipalities. Hopefully with HR 40, we'll soon see this at the federal level as well, with the creation of a reparations study committee in the House. The question of what does restitution entail and what does compensation mean? So that's one track of reparations work. The second track of reparations work is different, and it comes out of a different lineage. It's the work of truth and reconciliation and of truth and justice, coming very much out of the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And we think, for example, of South Africa and the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Here, the work is of reconciliation, of listening to the experiences of the victims and the victimized, but also listening to the voice of those who descend from perpetrators and bystanders. And through that, having the opportunity to weave ourselves back into a narrative that is workable for all of us in our political and social community. So I'm valuing and lifting up that second track of reparations work too, and noting that it is rooted in the very important world historical events that took place thanks to Nelson Mandela, Winnie Mandela, and others in South Africa, and culminating in the 1990s. The third mode of reparations is really the one where I feel I contribute, and many of you in your own ways may also be contributing. And this is to the way that the humanities in particular, the Black humanities, the post-colonial humanities, play a central role in how we experience and think of reparations. Because what reparations means for this third track is reconstruction, is the reconstruction, the radical reconstruction of our world, the thinking beyond what we feel is possible, the sitting with what feels to be the irresolvable. And when we turn to history and we see how deep the process of injustice goes, and how even the instruments and the tools that were supposed to deliver justice, in fact, only redoubled injustice, irresolvability emerges, brokenness emerges. But I think that what the Black humanities and the post-colonial humanities do, and what they're doing in a variety of ways today, is they're allowing us to recognize that there is something beyond our feeling of the irresolvable, and that is radical reconstruction. The radical reconstruction of social policy, of economic arrangements, of the criminal legal system, but also the radical reconstruction of our relationships together, even our intimacies together at a social level. And so as I read and as I speak, I want to frame that third mode, that third contribution of reparations work, and suggest to you that it plays a very important role. It's the work of changing our minds, of changing our mindsets. And that's very important in this time, as the other two modes are also working out. Let me return to my personal history again at the beginning of the book, and then I'll talk about the key thread, the key arc, historical arc that this book lays out. The rumor in my family is that my great-great-great-grandmother, Lorena Woodside, Ama Lorena, survived the horror of a slave ship chartered from Luanda, Angola, sometime in the 1880s. The story is full of voids, as I don't know where in Western or Central Africa she was kidnapped from, or how she ended up in Mastic Point to make a life with other people descended from African captives. She married a Black seaman named Ezekiel. Lorena died at age 19 after giving birth to her second child. I came to Andros because these meager details beckoned me. I consulted birth and marriage registers. I met with distant family members, fifth and sixth cousins removed, and traveled between villages along the northern coast. And what I encountered was not historical detail per se, but it was the information that came out of the historical void. None of the elder villagers I met remembered Ama Lorena because she had passed away so young, a generation before the oldest among them in Mastic Point was even born. My family's history of slavery traces in its gaps the obliteration of kinship ties committed by the weapons of slave ships. But before I departed Andros, a friend, whose name, by the way, was Virgil, took me to one of the island's blue holes. These are deep columns of water that descend into the limestone bedrock. Some even connect through subterranean caves directly out to the ocean. Standing at the edge of this blue hole, I noticed the pool's darkness and stillness, making the surface into a perfect mirror for the surrounding pine trees and the intense blue sky. It looked like a portal or a channel into the unknown and the submarine. On the edge of that geological enigma, I reflected on how my encounter with the void of my family's history had some relationship with the experience of peering into this blue hole. When it comes to histories that arise from the trauma of Atlantic slavery, voids and negations indicate both absence and some other obscure, submerged presence that calls to be known. So I felt Ama Lorena there, is what I mean to say. I felt her presence there. As I walked around the pool, I felt compelled to tend to something, cross over into something, attune myself to what could not be seen, but was present nonetheless, and had always been present and was beckoning to me. It struck me that this was, in a way, like our relationship to history itself, history filled with the sordid unknowns and unclaimed experiences that call out from the voids. Now, from there, I want to explain to you a little bit about the way I conceive of ghostlining, the creation of ghosts, and how ghosts, the creation of ghosts, in the way that I'm talking about it in this book, relates to those voices in the void, the presences that want to be recognized, that want to be disclosed. And as these presences around us, they're in our ancestry, they're in our social relations, they're in the history of what race, the defacing history of what race and colonialism has done. As these voices speak to us, my proposal to you is that there is an ongoing, I'll almost call it an addiction or a compulsion to disavow these voices, to deny them a reckoning. And that practice of this compulsive denial of the voices of history, that's what I call the practice of ghostlining. To ghost someone is to ignore them, to see through them, and to look past them. To ghostline a people's history is to systematically ignore the meaning of their collective experience generation after generation, century after century. Ghostlining, as distinct from color lining or from redlining, is the cunning practice adopted by whole societies that takes place up in the mind of unseeing the plundered parts and unhearing their historical demands for reparative justice. The ghosts in our social order are the misrecognized and the disavowed and the ignored historical presences among us. Ghostly matter, to use the famous formulation of Avery Gordon, is actively produced from social trauma and denial, disavowal. Because of slavery and colonialism, certain human groups have been made into, quote, phantoms in other people's eyes. As Ralph Ellison diagnosed in Invisible Man, ghosted people are made into, quote, the personification of the negative and into, quote, the amorphous thing. They are told, you don't exist. Your history doesn't exist. They're often told, just move on. That happened long ago. It's time to look forward. And that their history is not substantial enough to remember, to be called human history, and to demand redress. Ghostlined experience is its own kind of trap, which affects the ghostliner as much as those who are ghostlined, which affects everything to do with daily life, including access to food, housing, education, civic protections, the vote, but also access to reciprocity, which is the fundamental meaning of justice, access to social peace, which is something we all crave. The political line between the remembered and the disavowed causes illness for everyone involved. For everyone involved. So now that you have the conceptual framework of how my book is organized, what it's interested in the reparations work that takes place in our minds as much as in committee meetings around restitution, redress, and reconciliation. Now I'd like to lay out that arc that I mentioned, the arc of the book's historical presentation. And then from there, I'll read briefly from a section later on in the book that features how Black communities undertook the work of reparations from below, really from the start of when the abolitions began, when emancipation started. And then I'll conclude at the end with another contemporary current day vignette about what's taking place in a very small village in Jamaica, a village that I go to every year in July to visit Erna Broadburn. This book pursues a comparative perspective on emancipation processes across the globe. I look at 5 types of emancipation across the Americas, Europe, and Africa, which reverberate across Asia too. I begin with what is termed, it's well established, the gradual emancipations in New England, the American Mid-Atlantic, and how these gradual emancipations, which begin really around the 1770s, served as a kind of model that then traveled to the Spanish Americas and were enacted in the Spanish Americas beginning in the 1810s during the Spanish-American Revolutionary Wars. Now, that first part of the story really goes from the 1770s to the 1810s. So if you keep these historical periods in mind, you'll see the narrative emerge. Gradual emancipations were an invention, a very fascinating legal invention. And they come and reference the term emancipation, of course, which comes from the Latin word emancipatio. And emancipatio means, quote, to let free from his hand, to let free the property that is his own. So embedded in the etymology of the word and in its root in ancient Roman law is the legitimation of a supposed authority of some kinds of people to trade or sell ownership rights, emancipatio, in other kinds of people. Under Roman law, emancipatio referred to the act by which the head of a family, a property-owning male householder, could voluntarily, if he so choose, give up his power, his potestas, over other human beings in his household, including children and slaves. So emancipation, etymologically and legally, actually traces from that principle. Emancipation was thus legally construed as the voluntary grant of an owner, but not as the righteous vindication of the captives. And we see that this logic of emancipation, when it was first invented, because the first emancipations in the world were taking place on this continent, in places like Pennsylvania in 1780, they took very seriously this idea that freedom was a grant, in some ways a benevolent grant, from an owner of a human commodity. This had various consequences. This logic, if you like, had various consequences. This original sin, if you like, had various consequences. And one of the key consequences was that even amidst the so-called emancipation of 1780, the very first one in the world, we have the production of captivity in its aftermath through the captive labor system, the indenture system that went along with this form of gradual emancipation. So concretely, what happened was that slave owners were decreed to free their slaves, but they were given a period of time by which they could continue to benefit from the forced labor of children who were born before the date of March 1780. So any children up to the age of 27 years old had to continue, children, young adults, had to continue in servitude to the erstwhile slave owner until they reached that age. Also, people who were all adults and enslaved after March 1780 remained enslaved just as they had been before. The only individuals who were freed nominally were the children born of enslaved women after March 1780. This was called the Freedom of the Womb Law. And this Freedom of the Womb Law spread like DNA across the Americas over the coming 80 years. It informed even the last emancipations that were to take place in Cuba and in Brazil. And so in this, we see legally how unfreedom, how slavery was in fact being continued in and through the instruments that were to end slavery. Now, the story here is one of innovations and modulations of this theme. This is where I'm asking you, as I continue to walk through the story, to observe your reactions and the feelings that are coming up. Because I recognize that the term emancipation means something culturally for us. And I also imagine that we have certain understandings of emancipation as they relate to anti-slavery and obviously the history that I'm disclosing here is troubling that, is disrupting that. After the 1780 moment, we move forward in time to the 1790s, 1800s, to the period of what I call the retroactive emancipation that was invented in Haiti. Very briefly, we know that Haiti had its final revolutionary liberation in 1804, 1805. In the aftermath of that great moment, Haiti, as we know, thanks to the New York Times, for example, and a number of historians who've been working on this, was treated very differently than, for example, the United States of America, which had a revolutionary independence movement just a couple decades earlier. The emancipation that came is retroactive because the French imperial state refused to recognize Haiti's independence. Haiti declared itself an empire. It wasn't waiting for European or North American powers to recognize it. But within the international imperial system of the time, Haiti was burdened with boycotts and with isolation, diplomatic isolation, economic isolation. And the French insisted on keeping Haiti isolated for 25 years after it had won its own freedom through the revolution, until Haiti would agree to be emancipated by the French. So this is the innovation, if you like, the cunning innovation, but also the gall of this whole system. That only in 1825, once the Haitian president, Boyer, agreed that yes, Haiti as a nation would be emancipated by the French, did the French then agree to finally call Haiti by its chosen name, not by the imperial name that it had been given, the dead name of Saint-Domingue. And in order to be, quote unquote, emancipated, having already achieved its own freedom, we see the logic of Pennsylvania coming in. So there's a learning process that's going on, whereby the Haitian state had to now pay a debt to the French state, 20 million francs, which by the end would amount to some $27 billion in today's money, and would be paid to the French government over the course of the coming 100+ years, creating the very first instance of third world debt. And third world debt would spread again, like DNA, over the face of the global South in the coming 200 years. The retroactive emancipation in Haiti. And here, the innovation being the demand of not free labor, but the demand of a reparations for slave owners paid in cash to the French nation. The next innovation comes in the 1830s, so just a decade afterwards. And the learning process is very clear because we know that British policymakers were studying what was happening in Haiti. They were also very aware of what had happened in the American North for obvious reasons. They had consultations with Pennsylvania lawmakers as well, and they here created what came to be known as the compensated emancipation system. The compensated emancipation system became the gold standard for how to emancipate the enslaved. And it was the gold standard because it paid the gold like never before to the enslavers by, number one, giving them access to free labor for years after the emancipation date. You think back to the Pennsylvania model of gradual emancipation, and also giving the enslavers actual reparations payments in cash. Here we think about the Haiti model, and doing so on a scale that was unprecedented. So the British government, many of you know this story, and I will toot my horn here that the full scale of this came out in a Guardian piece in 2018, and that was rooted in my work that I wrote. I was writing to HM Treasury, the British Treasury, asking them for details on. We knew how much the debt was. The British government went into a huge debt. It was 40% of their GDP. They took it out in 1835. We knew how huge the debt was, but we never heard what happened to the debt. Nobody talked about it, as if the money just came from somewhere. It was a debt. So how was it paid back? And through the interactions that I had with the murky system at HM Treasury, we uncovered that in fact the debt was only finally repaid in 2015, which was, you can imagine, 3 years after this discovery came to light. Meaning that for 180 years, the British government was paying creditors who had allowed for it in 1835 to pay 20 million pounds, which would be about 200 or 300 billion pounds today, to some 44,000 slave owners in the British Empire. So it was an emancipation of huge scale, and it was so huge that the debt wave that it created washed over not just the British nation, but the Commonwealth. Now that we're talking about the Commonwealth, in the aftermath of, in the context of Queen Elizabeth's death, this is the reality, the condition that emancipation engendered. One other important point to make about this huge emancipation debt: because the British government was paying this, it also means that Black Britons were paying this through their taxes all the way up to 2015. It also means that Caribbean nations were paying this all the way up until their independence in the 1960s, and continued to pay this in terms of through Commonwealth transfers that they made all the way up until 2015. The British compensated emancipation. It then spread as a model for how to free the enslaved. It spread because it made a lot of sense to empires to end slavery in this way. So the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Danish Empire, the Swedish Empire, the Cubans, the Brazilians, they all implemented the compensated emancipation model. President Lincoln implemented the compensated emancipation model in Washington, D.C., and was hoping that it might be the model that could end the institution of slavery in the United States. The American South was not willing to be compensated for the end of the right to own the enslaved, and so the war had to continue. But we see how powerful this model was, and it set the tone for the coming 20 years and more. See, I won't continue too much longer. Now, the final two emancipation modes are the following. The American mode, which was innovated beginning in 1863, when President Lincoln determined that the British mode was not going to work. War emancipation was the answer, which is to end slavery through war. Of course, the war had started before, but then it became a foregone conclusion. Here, in the aftermath of the war, however, reparations were yet again paid in kind to enslavers. This began in 1865 when the reparations of land we know of through Sherman's Special Order number 15 were revoked, and the confiscated lands were returned to the planter class. But also we think of the innovations in law that began to emerge. I would point even to the second articles of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. Those amendments were very important for enfranchising African American people and also for stipulating the end of slavery as part of our constitutional structure. But they had loopholes in them. And these loopholes were written in, I would propose, again, as a form of planter reparations. I would think of the Jim Crow legal system and the forms of extra legal terror that they made room for as forms of in-kind transfers to the planter class and to the world that they wish to sustain. And that helps us to explain why America's reality, its current day reality, is the way that it is. Because the emancipations, at least that's my argument here, were designed to continue the racial oppression, not to end it. And finally, what I call the conquest emancipations that washed across Europe, that washed across Africa, I should say. One of the insights that comes out of this research, this comparative research, is to show that in every moment of emancipation, from the 1770s all the way until the 1880s, there was always a reference point in Africa. The emancipations were never only an American story. They were simultaneously an American and an African story. So, for example, already by the 1790s, we have the creation of the world's first emancipation colony, and that colony was in Sierra Leone. In that colony, the British state began to carry out what it called the emancipations by sea, where squadrons of British patrol ships would commandeer slave vessels, bring these slave vessels onto shore at Sierra Leone, at Freetown, take the enslaved out from the hole, and then make them into the contraband of war. Not into persons, but into contraband. And we see how that will resonate with what happens in the Civil War later on. And furthermore, these captives were not freed in the way that we might imagine, but they were put into a system of 14-year indentureship. And just like we saw in the Pennsylvania model, they were forced into forced labor. That mode of emancipation by sea affected Africa beginning in the 1790s. We could go into more detail around how Africa was implicated in the British emancipation of the 1830s, or even what was happening in the 1860s with in the context of the American Civil War. Footnote that General Wolseley, who was in charge of the British African conquests in the 1860s and 70s, wrote a book about how much he admired the Confederacy and how much Confederate warfare was a model for British warfare in Africa. So these lines are very, very interconnected. But conquest emancipation, I won't go into much detail now, is fascinating because it creates another innovation in the logic of emancipation. And this innovation is, the question was for the policymakers at the time, if the slave owners are no longer white, but are in fact Black or African or Indian, what kind of emancipation, what kind of reparations do they deserve? Do you pay reparations to African slave owners? Because of course, African slavery is a part of this story as well. The answer was no. What the British Empire devised was something that they called the Indian emancipation model. And the logic of this model was that in the non-American European world, slavery was a cultural phenomenon. It was a marker of civilizations that were not yet fully developed. And so what the British would do is, as opposed to enforcing abolition, they would simply colonize the people. And over time, slavery would become vestigial. It might take 30, 40, 50 years, but over time, the very presence of the British would civilize the elites enough so that slavery would fall away. This was called the permissive freedom model, the Indian emancipation model. And it is the model that was spread across Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya and other parts of British East Africa, as well as the French and the Portuguese were doing the same in Africa in the 1880s onwards. So that's the story. of my book. In some ways, we might say it's a tragedy, but it is also a very important reality to disclose and to recognize in its scope and its scale. And I think this learning process that was taking place over the course of these time periods and these continents tells us about the design and the mentality of design that was going into preserving the socioeconomic basis of white supremacy. This connects to our present moment and to reparations discussions, because I'll give you one hook in the interest of not going on too long and opening up for conversation. And that hook is that one of the most, I would say, common and potentially politically powerful, at least in public discourse, oppositions to this idea of the obvious need for reparations is the logic that it happened long ago. Now, if we look more carefully at that logic of it happened long ago, what's really being said, I think, is at least two things. Number one, that past period that we're talking about is distant from this present moment. So there's this idea of distance that's being asserted. And the longer something is in the past, even if it's traumatic, it's an event. And as a traumatic event, we can do personal work, we can move past it. That's the logic of distance. But the other part of the logic that's at work there is what I think of as the logic of supersession, meaning time operates whereby one moment of time supersedes the last moment of time. And so it's not just that this past is distant, but it's that there have been various other superseding events that have taken place that complicate our relationship to this distant past. So past and supersession, distance and supersession, I think, are principles that are being invoked in this public discussion and this public debates around why reparations is in fact not a legitimate discussion. But if what the Black humanities, what the post-colonial humanities can show and do show in a variety of ways is that the past is not distant. The past is the condition for the present. It is the climate for the present. And it's the climate of the present, not only from some high, theoretical and philosophical level, but it's the climate for the present because it was designed to be that way. Emancipations designed the past to be the structure, the infrastructure of our present world. Then we collapse the distance between past and present. And we also get around and make clear why supersession is not the way that we relate to our history. We have to relate to our history in some other way. And I think that way involves the commitment to radical reconstruction. So please allow me to read now just the last section of my book, and then I'll stop for questions and answer. I want to read, I was just in Woodside with Nana Erna, Sister Erna, in July. She holds an event in the 2 days before West Indian Emancipation, so July 29th and 30th every year. And this is a little bit about that gathering. Each year in the Jamaican village of Woodside, high up in the Cockpit Mountains, Erna Broadber organizes a reenactment of Emancipation Day with her community. Woodside is on the site of an 18th century coffee plantation, and many people in the village trace their families back to the enslaved and emancipated on this ground. On July 31st, the village stays up all night. At daybreak, community members parade to the hill where the enslaved had once erected their own small church. Those gathered perform a play, and someone reads aloud the Emancipation Proclamation of 1838. In the performance, the community talks back to the proclamation. People ask, for example, of course it begins, God save the Queen. People ask, why should God save the Queen and not the people? How come there was no apology for our enslavement? How can there be freedom without access to the materials to enable and protect our freedom? Villagers speak to those who never stopped to heed the voice of the oppressed. They speak to those who are the ghostliners. Then comes a 5-mile procession with drumming and singing around the perimeter of the old coffee estates. The day ends with a common meal of food brought from homes, aital, pakasa, and other stews. The reenactment, the celebration, and the rituals of redress all serve to create space around history. This black space, as Brodber calls it, is the needed psychic and political space, even on the scale of a village, to offer safe harbor to our ghosts and to imagine how the future of this whole world can be radically different from the trajectory of the past. History's unendings demand that we linger with the voids and not look past them, and history requires that individuals, institutions, states, and international organizations participate in reckoning with reparations for slavery. Emancipation processes saw the future after slavery through the eyes of perpetrators. Justice requires the proper readjustment of the relationship between all of us affected by the legacies of slavery, so that we can be something more human, perhaps something even more than human together, so that we may make something shared and new together from all these plundered parts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to moderate questions from here and from online. Open it up. I'm going to start with my own questions. I'll get the role. The moderator. But I think it's very interesting, this concept around language, emancipation, and liberation. And I think for many of us, they were synonymous. But in reading your book, they clearly are not. And so we have Black liberation movements, we have emancipation. How do we get to this point where fundamentally we redefine this movement and we look back and we are critical of emancipation in a way that I think gives it this justice, right? I mean, as I was telling you earlier, I read your book, and clearly there's a deficiency in history because the emancipation, we don't view them as these barriers to freedom. We think, oh, this was the door through which we all walked through. So I guess my question for overcoming is this notion of, if we reframe it, does that help the narrative of changing the present with this sort of past condition?
Yeah, I think it's a very important reframing, and it comes back to this underlying principle, or this underlying conception of distance. I think it has a lot to do with how we think of the distance between the past and the present in the following way. If emancipations are a door, like you say, or like you were proposing, and that's how we think of emancipations. Anti-slavery is the movement, emancipation is the door, and the process is abolition. And what happens is slavery ends. Then what happens from one emancipation to the next is the creation of more and more distance from that institution. But if emancipations are not a door, but if they're more like a portal or a bridge that actually is transferring racial oppression from the past into the new present, then it's not creating more distance, it's actually preventing distance between where we are today and the roots of our discontents. So I think that for me is where I think the conceptual reframing is so important, is to try to lock down in a more tangible way why it is that the past is the condition for our present, the climate for our present. That it's not only a kind of a poetic observation or something that a historical philosopher might say, but it's actually designed that way. We've never been allowed to leave our past behind, even as we've been told we are. And that's where the ghost lining of ourselves and our relationship to each other, our relation to our past, has been so entrenched. So I'll stop there. But I think it is very powerful to not think of emancipation as door, but as portal, as bridge.
Follow up on this question. How do you see, and it seems to me that a true reparation would be the emancipation of the all thought, right? That's the way you finally have that real difference in the past. You're right. I think that the way it was done through history erased some terms or removed some terms, but didn't change the condition. And that once that condition is, then the new definition of emancipation is the one that we thought we were working for.
And so what I would say, not to play language games, but what I would say is I'd like to call that liberation. I would like to say let's not pursue emancipation. Let's pursue, in fact, Black communities valued this term, and that's important also as part of the story. Nana Erna holds Emancipation Day celebrations. But often Black communities would talk about self-emancipation. I think that's significant. There was a hyphenated concept of emancipation, and it was, why self-emancipation? Because embedded in the word is this etymology where it's not mine to have, it's mine to be received. So self-emancipation was a way of pressing back against that. But to get to the other part of your question, I think that reparations work today is simultaneously also abolition work today, right? And I think so. I picked that up in your question. I agree, and that's why abolitionism is as much a present commitment, a present-day commitment, as we think of it as one rooted in the past, because abolition has not come. Yeah.
And if you could repeat the question to the folks online.
Sure.
Okay, this is a long, I'm a historian as well, and I hear this talk and it makes me think about what the discipline of history owes in terms of reparation. Because it seems like the practitioners of history, particularly the 19th century practitioners, created their gates and models of the distancing and chronological divisions that we have now naturalized. So when I hear this, I think, well, is this a call to disciplinary arms? If we're going to world make here in Sarah Ahmed's words, which I kind of like, but is that part of an underlying call in this book, which I will go out and read? That in order to do what you think is not most important, but equally important, is this radical reconstruction of how we understand the world and this world-making part. Do we need to blow up these traditional disciplines that were complicit in creating this system?
Thank you.
So how are we going to do that?
Yes. Always the hard question is in the clause at the end. Yeah. Yeah, right. So the question is, how is the discipline of history implicated in this very problem that we're discussing, in the way that historians and the discipline of history has constructed and perpetuated an understanding of time and this concept of distance, and history as a series of events. And so I've been interested in for maybe just for the benefit of simplifying in my own mind and contrasting between two ways of thinking about history. One is very much a liberal mode of narrating history, which the historical profession emerged to narrate and then to authorize and legitimate. And that mode has all of the features that we've just been speaking. history as a series of events separated by distance, where events supersede each other. And oddly, professional historians, the Guild of Professional Historians, has actually created the environment in which it seems legitimate to say, look, it's time to move on. So in that context, you're absolutely right that what I do believe is that we need to, if I can use a word that I'm borrowing from Ronaldo Alcott, who is a Black scholar in Toronto, we need to desecrate professional history. We have to desecrate it, and we have to rupture it. And so I think that call to arms is a good language for this. I mean, this is work that has consequences, and thinking of what the professional historian, or what those of us in the university, because I think every university discipline is actually coming out of this kind of mindset, and is perpetuating, it creates the terms by which, racial oppression, colonial violence, gendered violence is actually being legitimated in society. That what the academic must do is increasingly reimagine themselves as part of a much larger social structure, a much larger social struggle. Just like, in Baltimore, Vincent Harding imagined the Institute for the Black World in the 1970s. And, he invited Caribbean activist scholars like Sylvia Wynter, George Beckford, and others to come and participate with him. And part of what they insisted on is that they were intellectual workers in freedom struggle. So if the academic rethinks herself and himself and themselves as intellectual workers in liberation struggle, then that means that we're actually in league with a whole bunch of other people who are working that we're told not to participate with and participate in. And I think that's the way forward. I think that and that creates a new opportunities for learning for us within the university, especially learning from activists who are working outside the university.
That be the name of our union?
Yes, yeah, you can.
Not the age.
Definitely not the age.
Considering what their principles say.
It's not going to go over well.
Truly illuminating for me, and when I read the title of the book, I knew that there would be a triumphant narrative at the end, but I was hopeful, right? So I taught the intro African American History Survey, and not once have I ever said failure of emancipation. So even in the language, usually we talk about the failure of Reconstruction, right? So President just wants something. So when I was hearing, I was like, I'm going to have to reframe, right, this whole exercise on what we think about that time, but particularly in the United States. And my question to you is, if the system is designed, if emancipation in the U.S. actually worked the way it was designed, with the loopholes inherent, how do we even get to this next part of talking about historic justice, or we talk about reparations, any of the other things that would connect to that emancipation, right? So my question for you is, after that soliloquy is, how do we now approach this with your new thesis on it? Emancipation failed, not just here, but almost everywhere. And in that failure, we have to recognize that until people actually are true to emancipating people, we can't even talk about any of the solutions. How do we approach that?
Yeah. Well, I just have a beginning of an answer to the question. I'll repeat the question, which is, given what I have been saying in terms of, how emancipation itself can only be thought of as failure, what do we do with this in terms of having contemporary conversations around reparations? Where could we even begin in a discussion around reparations? I mean, what I'm hearing you ask is, how could we even be having conversations around restitution and compensation without first getting to the basis of what the problem is? The problem is much bigger than the history of slavery. The problem is the fact that slavery, but then also the stories and the lies about how slavery ended have actually created a kind of system of myths and falsehoods that are, like we've been saying, are the condition, the climate for everything that we think in this nation today. So the beginning of my answer is to go back to those three modes of reparations and to think of them as each playing an important part in the project, in the work of the 21st century. And I say the 21st century because Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the West Indies, who is one of the leading kind of activist scholars working around the reparations movements on an international scale, he insists that we think of the 21st century as the century for what he calls reparatory justice. In other words, this is the time. I like that, first of all. And I like that he's saying, this is going to be a big deal. So it's going to take 100 years, so this is not going to happen this year. We have 100 years to get this done. I appreciate that because it suggests how big the problem is. But if the legal discussion has to be had and we can't delay it, so we do need to talk about restitution, compensation. That has to be part of this discussion, if only because that actually helps to frame in the public mind how we think about harm. So that plays an important role. Reconciliation needs to be part of it as well. Truth and reconciliation, truth telling needs to be a part of it as well. And that needs to start now. But both of those modes actually rely upon the humanities doing something in a very activist way, which is tearing off the veil, tearing off the mask, making people uncomfortable with what they think they know, forcing us to sit with the void and say, this is not resolvable. Because I find that is actually very important. Every time I read about reparations, or often when I speak about reparations, there is the question, but what do we do about it? I mean, what can we possibly do? It's everywhere. It's in everything. The lie is so great. Where do we begin? But that's the point, is to get us to a place where we're confronting how irresolvable the situation is, because it's only then that new thinking becomes possible. So I actually think part of our role is to really show how irresolvable, how unsolvable this mess is, but with a sense of hope. And the hope is important as well, because I didn't get to that in the book, but one of the things that I very intently want to point out in the book is that, as opposed to thinking of reparations work as something that has started recently, and there's this narrative, which is that first came the Second World War and the genocide of the Jews of Europe, and then came the 1970s and the 80s and the dictatorships in South America and in Africa, and we had various modes of reparations taking place. And then now we're talking about reparations for slavery. It's the third step in this sequence. When in fact, the very term reparation was used by Ottobah Cugoano, who many of you know this, was a Black freed person in London working in the 1790s. And in his book, he said, at the end of slavery, there must be a reparation for bondage. And he had his own philosophy of what reparation should be like. So reparation has been a discussion in Black communities from the very time that even before emancipation started, but also Black communities have been working out, and I think that's an important part of reparations work as well, what I think of as reparations from below, the reparations that don't wait upon the state for a solution, but that actually say, this is what liberation looks like. Under these conditions. I think of the Black church. I think of the free village movements. I think of Pan-Africanism. I think of the Black Power movement, so many ways in which within a context of irresolvability and impossibility, Black communities create space for liberation and invite others to participate in that space. To me, that's part of also where the solution will continue to be.
got a Zoom question, and then I'm going to Sean, okay? We're going to Zoom question, and then, so the question from Zoom sphere. How do you propose the University of Missouri, a state institution, implement your objective of current proposed General Assembly and control of the university's budget? I will take it a step further and say this, and frame it as follows. How do you implement those suggestions, given the current desire not to engage in history teaching that is factual and relevant, and would actually illuminate and highlight the things you said, but to forget that, right? How do you sort of engage when it's clearly a current backlash to the things you just said?
Yeah.
Folks need to know that university or whatever, simply saying, no, we don't want to teach that. We can't teach that because it no longer fits that narrative.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
So the question is at a university that we will not name, an anonymous university, where there is a project to defund history and the humanities and not to tell the actual story about how race and slavery and colonialism work. How does one go about doing the work of reparations, whether from below or through the institution? That's a great question, and because it allows me to make a connection with something that I myself am trying to think about and work through right at this time. So, and in collaboration with a group of other folks. And so part of what I want to do is to kind of invite you to participate in this network, and you can reach out to me and I can tell you more. But some of you may already be involved in the network called Scholars for Social Justice, and Scholars for Social Justice emerged really galvanized in 2020, but it existed before, and it's doing precisely the work of saying the Black Lives Matter movement that was being and is being articulated and worked out on the streets is instructive for the scholar activist who is in the university, and the perimeter of the university has to fall, and it's a radical collective endeavor to as Fred Moten would say, work in, through, and unto the other side of the university enclosure in the pursuit of social justice and racial justice. And what Scholars for Social Justice is doing, and it just developed this model, is what they're calling the ARIS model, ARIS, the Abolition, Reparation, Investment, and Security model. And part of this is a strategy to develop a new way of talking about what the university should be doing, to basically say, we understand what DEI is about, or IDE, or DIJ, or whatever that current very deadly, very destructive and cunning form of ghostlining is that we see being instituted through universities in the United States and other parts of the world. And I want to put a footnote there to say, even within that deadliness, there are ways to repurpose it and to use it against its own ends. And so I'm honoring that and recognizing how that's taking place, while also saying how to confront the established corporatized DEI model of quote unquote anti-racism work with a different way of thinking. And this ARIS model, which is really highlighting abolition and reparation and highlighting the political economy of the university, how it relates to communities outside the university walls, questions about labor justice within the university, issues around policing and the need to abolish the police, radical demands for social reconstruction, the demand for the reconstruction of university curricula. All of these are parts of the ARIS model. And what I find exciting is that there is a group that is now emerging to bring this forward. And one of the things that in some of the most recent conversations is the possibility of creating a kind of study group, a study network across multiple universities, where over the course, for example, of the coming year or 2 years, we can begin to share stories about what we're confronting, what we're learning, and what guerrilla warfare, what maroon warfare within the university might look like. Because if we want to desecrate the structures that are deadly, we have to actually then do it. We have to actually then find ways to do it, unless we don't think that they should change, because they're not going to change because we ask them to. So.
John?
Something else that you said about terminology, and for me, terminology seems like when they came up with emancipation, that was just the beginning of credit for the minute. A good way to say we're emancipating you, and all you have to do is pay back to the debt that you want to hold with impayable interest. Instead of us focusing on reparations, which I believe is something we need, why don't we use the same strategy that they use? Because reparations means you have to admit that you destroyed something to begin with. Why don't we come up with a terminology where we're saying the terminology for investing? We've had emancipation for 100 years. Why don't we have a 100-year investment plan and come up with some system like that? So we don't have to wait for reparations. They haven't came within the last 200 years. Let's think about investing and make that blended word stay over new people and kind of accomplish the goal without even doing just what they did. They said they emancipated instead of going to war to enslave people who were just enslaved financially. Instead of talking about reparations, let's talk about reinvestment on investment so we can get these debts paid back.
I hear you. The question is, what about thinking strategically about language and framing and using a different language to get to the ultimate goal? For example, the language of investment, as opposed to the language which is already going to raise people's hackles. Not people's, but the interest groups that we have in mind of reparations.
It all automatically comes with the system, and it seems like if you can accomplish the goal with less resistance, it's not like, let's not forget about reparations, not act like this didn't happen because it did. But let's tell those people who already know this happened and have some remorse for what happened. Let's get into a different marketing strategy to get that goal accomplished.
So I hear you, and I noticed that, for example, recently in Barbados, Maya Motley, the Prime Minister, has been doing this, especially when she's talking about what we might call climate reparations. She's using a different language. And she's talking about, a justice tax, for example. So using the language of a tax as opposed to reparations gets us maybe some other people in the room. Or thinking about investment, for example, in the Caribbean, as opposed to using the language of reparations. But where I would push back on that is to say that the imagination about aid, which is that the condition of the oppressed and the racialized can be recognized, people can feel bad about it, and then through their bad feelings, they can provide some aid for it. That doesn't go far enough. That doesn't go far enough to the revolutionary change of our mindset that we need. And that doesn't go far enough, frankly, for the person who's giving the aid. They need to do more work to understand why this is not about investment or aid. This is about changing the climate that is killing us all. And so I would argue that the reason to stick with the language of reparations and all the related language of abolition or liberation, things that get people's temperature up, is precisely because it's demanding language. It doesn't allow us to shirk away from what we actually have in front of us and the actual problem that exists. And until we keep pressing that, we're not going to see this change of the world that I think reparations is actually after. Reform is not going to do it. And I know that now that I'm speaking in this mode, it can sound very highfalutin and abstract. And so that's why I want to bring it back to say all three modes are important. We have to keep these three tracks. We have to keep our mind free and keep remembering that, yes, this is not acceptable. And even investment is not acceptable. That's not okay. While also working along the other two tracks, because we're in the system now, to make change given the system and the order and the policies that exist. All three are important. The problem as I see it is we don't make enough room for that third track, for the revolutionizing of our mind. And without that, the other two can't be activated and mobilized to the potential that otherwise they need to be. So that's, yeah.
And then Dave.
Yeah, actually, me first and then Dave?
No, you first, and then Dave. Yeah, couple more, last two questions here, and maybe Grant, and we can speak it, but go ahead, quickly.
Okay, yeah, actually, it's another kind of language question, it's more of a historical one. I was interested because you opened by mentioning how the nature of the process of emancipation is kind of baked into the meaning of the word itself. And I find it curious, particularly since you know quite a bit about German Enlightenment scholars as well, that this same term, at least in English as well as in German, is also used for the enfranchisement and lifting of restrictions on Jews in Europe around the same time, more or less. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, on why this same term emancipation is used to describe what is ostensibly supposed to be the removal of a system of oppression for, in this case, a white but nonetheless racialized religious other. It struck me that this same term is used to describe what is supposedly gifted to Jews in Europe, while at the same time supposedly being bestowed upon enslaved persons.
I think that's a great question. And the question is, in terms of the term emancipation, that it was also used for the emancipation of the Jews, which was a process that was taking place in the 19th century. What is either the etymological relationship, the historical relationship to that? Why were those two histories being connected, at least in language and in terms of historical time period? What explains this? And I would also add that emancipation was used as a key term in terms of emancipation of children from parents. There is also the emancipation of the serfs, in the 1860s and onwards in the Russian Empire. And so what is this term emancipation really saying? It's saying that a process of freedom is going to be generally imposed upon a segment of society, although the emancipation of children is slightly different, but it is about it is about freeing, obviously, but it's about freeing a group that in the legal terms, in the state's eyes, is seen as being subordinate to, not equal to, not on the same par with the group that was the erstwhile owner or oppressor. So what is being invoked and reinscribed in the language of emancipation in each of these modes is the differential between the owner and the owned, or the oppressor and the oppressed. And this is a very different imagination from saying captive and enslaver, that if we're talking about in terms of captive and perpetrator, for example, to use that language, we're talking about two human beings who are of the same status, but emancipation changes the status, and it makes it such that the law itself is refusing to recognize that the victim is a full person, So that is the cunning of the term emancipation and of the legal structures that that unfold from it. It basically exonerates the oppressor. And it does that in all of these cases.
For all these different subalterns.
For all of these different subalterns. Correct. Yeah. I think that's what I think is going on there. That's the use of the term.
Last two questions, Dave, and then.
Yes, thank you very much. People was talking about this. It was not my intention to ask you this.
You're not, because I'm about to do that last question.
Took care of that.
I'm glad I'm happy to hear the Pennsylvania, the city of Pride.
Right.
But I have a history question. So none of these entities that backed this gradual emancipation had stated in their naming of the organization or their language that they were aiming at emancipation. We had the Society of Defense in Philadelphia was set for the gradual abolition of state. They were very, very clear about what they wanted. It was in London, it was Society for the Abolition of Slave Trade and the Anti-Slavery Society. I don't recall an Emancipation Society. So I'm wondering if, how that kind of factors into your discussion. Because if these groups were deliberate in telling us what they were aiming, we want to get rid of slavery, but we don't want to live on it. We know this. So how does that kind of reach? How do you deal with that? Because I didn't do it.
Yeah. So the question is, why are there abolition societies and anti-slavery societies, but not really emancipation societies? Or that's not a very common way that people at the time were describing their project. And maybe underlying here is, what's the relationship between abolition and emancipation? And it is the case that there were some smaller emancipation societies, they called themselves emancipation societies, that emerged in the United States in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And they called themselves emancipation societies because they were especially inspired by the compensated emancipation in Britain. And their work was to say, let's take that model and apply it here. I feel the best answer to your question, it's a really good question, is that anti-slavery and abolition, which was a multiracial project, certainly, although in the way that formal, canonical historians write about abolition, they tend to focus on white abolitionists, was a project to end slavery. Yes, to end the institution of slavery. But it is always the case that the means is as important as the end. And the means are where things get really complicated. And to me, that's what the lesson is here, is wanting to end slavery is one thing, but really engaging in deep thought around what the process must be to create true liberation, true freedom through this. There was no discussion. Historically, there was no attention given to that. There would have been attention given to that if Black communities, who were the actual targets of the injustice, were allowed to be part of the policy-making, decision-making process, of now that we are talking about abolition, what should abolition mean? How should abolition happen? We know that Black communities who were using the word reparations, were having that conversation amongst themselves, but they weren't invited to the discussion table. So this is, to me, a lesson that goes to how we see problems repeat over and over again in our time, which is when a social ill is observed, often the political elites may agree that it should be ended, but you can be sure that they're not going to ask the victims to be part of the discussion around what redress must look like. They're excluded from that discussion. And that's where emancipation was the process that filled in the gap, and it served the interest of the planters. So that's what tends to happen, when the affected community is not involved, is not allowed to be the ultimate judge.
All right, last question.
I'm actually glad you referred to this kind of leads directly in mind. As far as the means
and in the pursuit of justice, we see, and this is kind of my little old school Marxist question here, the rise of corporations and the power to influence across the United States specifically. How does a movement discussing liberation and reparations remain organic and in control of those who have been wronged, without almost getting in bed with some of those powerful corporations and decision makers, because that's where the money is, without losing the very essence of what you find.
So the question is, how can the grassroots organic reparations movement really continue to grow and to expand without, quote unquote, getting into bed with corporations or, corporate capitalism and the market in a variety of ways? And the answer that comes to me is, we know it can happen because it's already happened. It's long been happening. Our problem is that we meaning it's not even the university, it's our public understanding, our public awareness is not attentive to how powerful and how expansive the grassroots reparations movement is, and it has taken many different forms over the course of the last 300 years. We might say that I would call this the Black radical traditions. The Black radical traditions have been at work for the past 300 years. Beginning in the time of the first failed emancipation, and they provide a kind of source, a kind of reservoir, if you like, of inspiration and political action that bubbles up into public discussion, and increasingly at various times they're more on the public mind than others. But even when they're not on the public mind, the media's mind, the mind of institutions, the mind of what's happening in universities, it doesn't mean that they're not at work or they're not expanding. And I'll give you one concrete example, which is, we don't talk about Marcus Mosiah Garvey very much, but Marcus Mosiah Garvey was part of a very powerful and extensive movement for reparations, for radical transformation that lasted, he started it around the 1910s, 1914, and continued. He was imprisoned and all of this, but it continued until after he left and transitioned to, and passed away. 1940s, 1950s, it was still going. The Garvey movement was still going. And Garvey had, just in terms of scale, had chapters, the UNIA movement had chapters, hundreds of chapters across the United States, had chapters in Africa, had chapters in Europe, were involved in creating the Black Star Line to create circulation between Africa and the United States. But even beyond Garvey, Garvey was able to do what he did at that scale because before him, there was Bedward, Minister Bedward, who was the convener of a huge reparations movement in rural Jamaica in the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, the turn of the 20th century. So if we talk about how many people were involved, we talk about, the ideas that these people were discussing, we talk about the vision that they had, it was on a massive scale. But what's interesting is that massive scale is not at all registered by the way that they appear in our history books, right? So maybe the answer is to look less to the corporations, because maybe that's not where the power is, the true power. Maybe the power is for us to look to the grassroots and to see what's actually happening and to participate, and to lift up. So we understand the reality as opposed to what I think is more as the branded fiction, And the last thing I'd say is, I think it actually fits very well into the logic of American capitalism to make social justice about individuals And we see so much of that, we see so much of this great person, that great person, this, brand, this brand, that brand. And not that the brands and the individuals are not important because they communicate something larger, but how do we free our minds and our imagination to really feel what it is to be in solidarity? That's kind of a Marxist answer to a Marxist question. I think it's possible. I think we have to do some work to get there.
I just feel like the follow-up response would be like as the movement gains, it's gonna be the idea that, and I'm sorry, their follow-up. It's the idea that as people of color start to become more and more participants within the market itself, that their movements will be reflected as well. More so by the people that have purse and money and the accent.
Possibly, but I don't actually think that that's where justice lies. I don't think that's the solution, and I don't think that that justice communities centered around people of color are on a track to even need to be more represented within systems of representation that are systemically racist. That's kind of not going to work. Yeah. So. But did he though? That's my question. Maybe we leave it there. Did you boys win and Garvey lose? I'm not sure. Okay. No.